Imagine this. It's past midnight in a quiet, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. The kind with cookie-cutter homes, pastel mailboxes, and an HOA president so power-hungry, she makes dictators look like kindergarten teachers. Then, boom, floodlights erupt. Security alarms blare. A goat named Buckshot charges out of the shadows. And two HOA board members? Caught red-handed, mid-trespass, one with a crowbar, the other with spray paint. Welcome to Walker Farm, where a Civil War-era barn, one furious farmer, and a whole lot of pent-up neighborly rage sparked an all-out war against the HOA from hell. What started as a passive-aggressive fine for non-compliant aesthetics turned into a legal firestorm, a national scandal, and, yes, an epic dunk tank featuring a mannequin named Karen. This isn't just a fight over fences and flower beds. This is about legacy, land, and the glorious unraveling of power in the most satisfying way imaginable. If you love petty revenge, bureaucratic takedowns, and watching tyrants get exactly what they deserve, then buckle up. Hit that subscribe button and support Real HOA Drama, where the lawns are green, the goats are angry, and justice always comes with a side of barbecue. Goat fire collision. Because this drama? It's real. The scene was straight out of a made-for-TV courtroom drama, except it was real, and I was the one with the smug grin and the upper hand. Red and blue lights flashed across the cul-de-sac like we were filming an episode of Cops. HOA edition. Karen, our beloved self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, stood at the barricade in her pastel power suit, her face contorted into a mask of outrage. Her voice, shrill enough to send local dogs into howling fits, sliced through the night like a steak knife through lukewarm butter. "You can't do this," she screeched, waving a manila folder like it contained the 10 Commandments. "This is an unlawful act of defiance. You're blocking emergency access. This is illegal." The police officers didn't flinch. They'd already heard the speech 3 times tonight. One of them, a seasoned-looking deputy with a coffee in hand and zero patience left, adjusted his belt and said calmly, "Ma'am, the road runs through federally protected land now. You'll need to take the alternate route." That's when I stepped into view. I was standing just inside my brand-new wrought iron gate, the kind that says, "No, you can't come in, and yes, it's on purpose." The motion-activated floodlights had clicked on dramatically, casting my figure in a cinematic glow. I leaned casually against the gate, arms crossed, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. Mounted in the center of the gate was a gleaming bronze plaque that read, "National Historic Landmark, protected under federal law." Just below it, a smaller sign, "No trespassing." No HOA access. Ever. I swear, if you listen closely, you could hear Karen's blood pressure rising. "Actually, Karen," I said, tilting my head slightly and savoring the moment like a fine glass of bourbon, "I can." And I just did. A hush fell over the rest of the HOA board, who had gathered behind her like ducklings behind their overbearing mother goose. Their eyes darted between the gate, the plaque, and the increasingly purple shade of Karen's face. She looked like she was about to either cry or explode, maybe both. That's when I turned and faced the camera. Yep, I had someone filming this. Because if you're going to wage war against an HOA, you document everything. I stared straight into the lens and let the moment hang in the air like the final note of a national anthem. "Let me tell you," I said, voice low, steady, and packed with the satisfaction of a man who just won a 10-round battle with bureaucracy and pettiness, how my land, the very piece of property they tried to erase, just became their worst nightmare. And just like that, the story rewound. It all started weeks ago, when a century-old barn and a stubborn streak collided headfirst with a suburban dictatorship. When I, Jack Walker, a man with a family legacy buried beneath the very soil they wanted to pave over, decided I'd had enough. Enough fines. Enough threats. Enough pastel-colored tyranny. This wasn't just a case of, "I don't like your fence." This was war. A war waged in letters, courtrooms, backyards, and late-night trespassing. A war they started, and one I intended to finish. So as Karen stood there under the harsh glare of federal law and her own self-importance, screaming into the void, I knew one thing for sure. The gate wasn't just closed on her access to my land. It was slammed shut on the reign of the HOA. And I had the only key. Walker Farm wasn't just a piece of land. It was blood, bone, and memory stitched into every weathered board and wild patch of earth. It had stood for over 150 years, a stubborn holdout from a time before cul-de-sacs, color-coordinated mailboxes, and HOA newsletters printed in Comic Sans. My great-great-grandfather built the original homestead with his bare hands and a mule that, according to family legend, once kicked a Confederate soldier. My grandfather, a World War II vet who could sharpen a knife with one hand and lecture you about personal responsibility with the other, inherited the land and kept it intact through wars, recessions, and one particularly nasty tornado. By the time it came to me, Jack Walker, it wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a legacy. And I wasn't about to let a woman named Karen with a clipboard and a superiority complex bulldoze it because it didn't match her beige-on-beige aesthetic. I still remember the day the first letter came. It was a lovely spring morning. Birds were chirping, the goats were bleating, and I was halfway through my second cup of black coffee when I opened the mailbox and pulled out what looked like an eviction notice dressed as a Valentine. Pink borders.
And bốt hoa logo.
Even a friendly, dear neighbor at the top. But the words inside were anything but friendly. Your barn is considered a visual disruption and safety hazard. Demolition is recommended. Noncompliance will incur a $500 daily fine effective immediately. I blinked.
Laughed.
Blinked again. Then read it out loud to Buckshot, my ornery little goat, who promptly headbutted the mailbox in protest.
Good boy.
See, here's the thing. Walker Farm was on the edge of the neighborhood. Technically, I wasn't part of the HOA. My land had been here before their development even broke ground. Long before Karen and her army of lawn-measuring zealots showed up with rules about fence heights, acceptable mulch colors, and how many wind chimes you're allowed before it becomes a nuisance. So I did what any red-blooded American would do. I walked over to the HOA office with the deed in one hand and a smug grin in the other. The office was painted taupe. Of course it was. Karen sat behind a desk, perched like a hawk guarding a nest made of bylaws and passive-aggressive intent. Her hair was pulled so tight, I'm pretty sure it affected her ability to blink. I dropped the deed on her desk. My property. Not yours. Try again. She didn't even glance down. Just smiled that smile people reserve for children and small dogs. We feel that your barn negatively affects the visual cohesion of the community, she said, with the robotic cadence of someone who'd practiced that line in the mirror. And under Section 14B of our covenant. I'm not in your covenant. She tilted her head, the way a cat does when it's trying to decide whether to kill something or just judge it. We'll see about that. And just like that, the war began. The next day, I got another letter. Then the second. Then came the fines, $500 a day, stacking like bad poker chips. All for a barn that had survived 3 wars, a plague of cicadas, and the occasional drunk deer. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about aesthetics. It was about control. Karen didn't care about my land's history. She saw a patch of old America in the middle of her cookie-cutter kingdom, and it made her twitch. To her, my farm was a glitch in the matrix. And glitches had to be erased. But what she didn't realize, what she never could realize, was that this farm had roots deeper than her entire subdivision. And I was the wrong man to try and prune it. This wasn't just a barn. It was home. And hell would freeze over before I let her tear it down. I've always believed that there's a right way to solve a problem. You gather the facts, present your case, and let logic do the talking. That's what my grandfather taught me, right after he taught me how to skin a rabbit and how to spot a liar by the way they blink when they speak. So when the HOA came knocking with their stack of phony violations and that ever-growing $500 a day fine, I didn't rant or throw a fit. I grabbed my deed, a copy of the county plat map, and a thermos of strong black coffee, and marched into the monthly board meeting like a man walking into enemy territory. They were already seated in their little makeshift courtroom, 5 board members, all wearing varying shades of khaki and disapproval. At the center of it all, perched like some kind of suburban pharaoh, was Karen. She looked up just long enough to see me, then went back to scrolling on her phone like I was just another fly buzzing around her lemonade. "I'm here to clear up a misunderstanding," I began, placing my paperwork neatly on the table before them. "Walker Farm is not, and never has been, under HOA jurisdiction. The property was established in 1872. This is the deed, recorded and notarized by the county. Here's the exemption clause from when the neighborhood was built." Karen didn't even blink. She folded her hands, tilted her head, and offered a smile so fake I swear it could have been licensed by Disney. "The board has already made its decision, Mr. Walker." "It's not your decision to make," I shot back. "You don't own my land." Karen leaned forward, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for slow drivers and telemarketers. "If your property negatively impacts neighborhood aesthetics, we have the right to enforce compliance. Our rules are about protecting home values, Jack. It's nothing personal." I could practically hear my grandfather's voice in my head. "Son, when someone says nothing personal, they're about to screw you over real personal." I stood my ground. "You're overstepping, Karen. And you know it." "We'll see about that," she said with a smirk. From that moment on, things got weird. Overnight, the HOA went from passive-aggressive to just plain aggressive. I started spotting unfamiliar SUVs parked at the edge of my property. Folks in polo shirts with clipboards loitering by the old oak tree near the south fence line. One of them crouched in the bushes with a tape measure, like he was on a special ops mission to document barn height violations. They thought I wouldn't notice. But Walker Farm has eyes. Cameras tucked under eaves and mounted in trees, watching every inch of soil. At first, I reviewed the footage with mild annoyance. But that changed real quick. One night, just past midnight, I sat at my desk with a beer in hand, reviewing the previous night's motion alerts. There was grainy footage, time-stamped and clear. Two figures, HOA members I recognized from the board meeting, sneaking up to the barn under the cover of darkness. One of them carried a spray can. The other held a flashlight. They walked right up to the weathered old doors and spray-painted a red X across the front beams. Not a warning. Not a notice. A mark. My hands clenched. That barn had stood for over a century. It had housed horses, feed, and family memories. It had survived storms, fire threats, even a lightning strike back in '92. And now some bureaucratic busybody in a polo thought she could tag it like it was condemned property? They had declared war. Quietly. Cowardly. But unmistakably. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up rewiring the motion sensors, adjusting the angle of the floodlights, and setting up a new camera with night vision and audio pickup. I wasn't just defending a building. I was defending history. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The night after I found the red X on my barn, I sat on the porch, a storm rolling in slow from the west like it knew I needed something to match my mood. I sipped whiskey straight from the bottle and stared out across Walker Farm, the land silhouetted against flashes of distant lightning. My grandfather used to say storms could stir up more than just the air. They shake loose the past, he'd mutter, always cryptic, always right. That night, the past came calling. I don't know what made me think of it. Maybe it was the barn. Maybe it was the war the HOA had just brought to my doorstep, or maybe it was the ghost of Grandpa Earl whispering in my ear. Whatever it was, I found myself in the attic at 2 a.m., covered in dust and cobwebs, digging through boxes of old tools and forgotten Christmas decorations until I found it.
The chest.
It was an old thing, walnut wood, iron hinges, and his initials carved into the lid, E.W. Earl Walker. The lock was rusted, but I pried it open with the stubbornness of a man who needed answers more than he needed sleep. Inside, tucked beneath a moth-eaten army jacket and a faded American flag, was a stack of leather-bound notebooks and parchment papers, yellowed with time. I brought them downstairs, laid them across the kitchen table, and began reading by the flickering light of an antique lamp. That's when the pieces started to fall into place. The journals were written in my great-great-grandfather's hand, steady, formal cursive, like each word was penned with purpose. In one entry dated August 14th, 1863, He described provisioning, the boys in blue, with dried meat, grain, and clean water. Another mentioned a hidden cache of medical supplies stored in the west side of the barn, and a brief line that stopped me cold. Walker Farm now serves as a depot for Union forces traveling south through Kentucky. I blinked, reread it, then read it again. My barn a Union supply depot? It wasn't just family lore anymore. It was history, and it might be the silver bullet I needed. But I wasn't about to take a 150-year-old journal into battle without backup. I needed an expert, someone who could turn a dusty ledger into documented proof. And that's when I remembered Emily Chen. I'd met her at the local historical society the year prior, when I donated a few of Grandpa Earl's World War II medals. She was smart, curious, and had that kind of enthusiasm for history that made you feel like time travel was just one dusty file away. Plus, she had the patience of a saint, which, given my current emotional state, was going to be necessary. I sent her a late-night message with a photo of the journal entry and the subject line. Found something big. Need your brain. She replied in 5 minutes flat. I'll be there tomorrow. Don't touch anything. True to her word, Emily showed up the next morning in jeans, a ponytail, and a backpack that probably weighed more than she did. She stepped into my kitchen like a woman on a mission, greeted Buckshot the goat like an old friend, and within 10 minutes had the journals spread out like an archaeological dig site. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes lit up. Jack, this isn't just interesting. This is significant. If the federal records back this up, your farm could qualify for National Historic Landmark status. Think that'd shut Karen up? She smirked. It'd do more than that. It'd make her HOA toothless. We spent the next few days buried in archives, digital databases, state military records, even microfilm reels that hadn't seen the light of day since the Reagan administration. Somewhere between the excitement of discovery and our mutual hatred of bureaucracy, something shifted between us. It started with shared coffee, turned into long evenings laughing over absurd HOA bylaws, and by the third night, we were finishing each other's sentences and debating which founding father would have hated Karen the most. Our money was on Jefferson. But I didn't have time to dwell on feelings. Not yet. Because if the records were right, and Emily was sure they were, then this war had just taken a wild turn. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting to protect a forgotten piece of American history. And Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. If I thought finding out my barn was once a Union Army supply depot would make the HOA back off, I clearly underestimated the sheer depth of Karen's pettiness. Turns out, when you corner a control freak, they don't retreat. They double down with the ferocity of a wet cat in a room full of rocking chairs. It started with another letter. This one wasn't wrapped in pink borders or dressed up like a friendly, neighborly notice. No, this one came via certified mail, stamped with enough legal jargon to make a paralegal weep. The header read, Emergency Demolition Order, Code Compliance Breach. According to the HOA, my historic barn, now confirmed to have stored Civil War-era cannonballs and salted pork, was a clear structural threat to the community. Apparently, its mere existence posed an immediate safety hazard to adjacent properties, which was rich, considering the nearest adjacent property was a good 300 yards away and belonged to a man who just installed a 12-foot inflatable Santa Claus riding a shark. Safety hazard, my ass. But it didn't stop there. The next day, I caught sight of 3 guys in reflective vests lurking near the barn, one of them holding a clipboard, the other 2 poking around the foundation with measuring tape, and the kind of intensity usually reserved for crime scenes. I stepped out onto the porch, hands on my hips. Hey, you boys lose a golf ball or just out measuring things that don't belong to you. One of them cleared his throat and said, We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association, sir. Surveying for potential code violations. You're standing on federally exempt land, I said, pointing to the bronze landmark plaque mounted near the gate. Hope your boss likes lawsuits. They left pretty quick after that. But the message was loud and clear. Karen wasn't done. She'd officially entered her villain origin story arc. So I called up my lawyer, Ben. a guy who wore cowboy boots with his suit and had the charming habit of quoting the Constitution like scripture. After reviewing the demolition order, he gave a dry laugh and said, "They don't have a legal leg to stand on. But you're going to want to play offense, not just defense." And offense I could do. That night, I upgraded the farm's entire security system. Motion-activated floodlights, high-definition night vision cameras, and a couple of fake warning signs about armed peacocks, just for fun. I even rigged a few Alexa-enabled speakers to play Civil War marching music anytime someone stepped too close to the barn. And wouldn't you know it? Not even 72 hours later, the cameras caught them. 2:43 a.m. Two HOA members, dressed in dark hoodies like some kind of suburban ninjas, slinking through my field. One carried a can of red spray paint, probably planning to mark the barn again. The other? A crowbar. Bad move. As soon as they stepped past the fence line, boom. My floodlights snapped on like the wrath of God. The speakers blasted Battle Hymn of the Republic at full volume. One guy screamed, dropped the spray can, and bolted. The other tripped over a goat, cursed loudly, and ran straight into the garden gnome collection I had reinforced with rebar for this exact reason. I reviewed the footage, edited it down, added subtitles for comedic effect, and posted it to every social media platform I had. Within hours, it had gone viral in our town. By lunchtime, it was on the front page of the local news site with the headline, "HOA caught trespassing on historic farm. Goat named Buckshot involved." Then came the hashtags. Hashtag Save Walker Farm. Hashtag Karen Can't Censor History. Hashtag Goat Justice. Support flooded in neighbors, veterans, local history buffs. Even a Civil War reenactment group from 2 towns over offered to set up camp on my lawn as a deterrent. Karen had tried to silence me with fines, threats, and phony demolition orders. But in trying to erase my farm, she'd done something she never expected. She made me famous. And I wasn't going anywhere. If you've never tried to get your property listed as a National Historic Landmark, let me save you the suspense. It's about as fun as dental surgery without anesthesia, except with more paperwork and fewer lollipops at the end. For weeks, Emily, Ben, my lawyer, and I lived on coffee, adrenaline, and a mutual hatred of government forms written like riddles from a bureaucratic sphinx. We cross-referenced old land deeds, dug through Civil War troop movement logs, and even tracked down a faded photograph of General Sherman's quartermaster allegedly standing in front of my barn. Emily practically lived in my kitchen, buried under piles of maps and documents, her hair in a messy bun, eyes locked on every historic breadcrumb like a hawk. I don't know exactly when it happened, but sometime between decoding 19th century handwriting and shouting at the county clerk's office on speakerphone, I started looking forward to hearing her laugh more than I cared to admit. But this wasn't just about flirtation over footnotes. This was a full-blown battle, and we were racing the clock. Karen wasn't letting up. The HOA kept filing complaints, pushing local officials, and whispering rumors to neighbors about how I was manufacturing history for personal gain. It didn't matter that the evidence was ironclad. When people like Karen feel power slipping away, they start throwing punches just to feel their knuckles crack. So we moved fast. We compiled affidavits, gathered witness statements, and digitized everything twice. When we finally sent the official packet to the Department of the Interior, it felt like shipping off a child to college, equal parts proud and terrified. That night, I grilled steaks on the back porch. Emily opened a bottle of cheap red wine, and we toasted to finally getting a break. The stars were out, the air was calm, and for the first time in weeks, I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd made it through the worst. Then the fire alarm went off. I ran to the back of the house and saw it, flames licking up the side of my storage shed, the same one where I kept all the hard copies of our research. Emily was already ahead of me, a garden hose in one hand, fury in her eyes. We managed to kill the fire before it reached the boxes, but the damage was done. Smoke curled out of the broken windows, and a sharp smell of accelerant hung in the air. That wasn't an accident. And it sure as hell wasn't random. As I inspected the charred remains of what had once been our backup plan, Emily sat on the steps, her palm bleeding from a shard of glass she'd punched through to reach the sprinkler valve. I knelt beside her, heart pounding with guilt and rage. "I should have kept everything in the house," I muttered. She looked at me, eyes fierce. "You didn't do this. They did." And they wasn't some shadowy cabal. It was Karen and her HOA minions, desperate and cornered, now willing to cross the line from civil nuisance into criminal sabotage. But here's the thing about community. Sometimes it surprises you. The next morning, as I stood surveying the wreckage, a voice croaked behind me. "Well, that's a damn shame." I turned to see Mr. Harold Reynolds, my next-door neighbor, hunched over his cane but wearing a sharp little smirk. Retired accountant. Served in Korea. Never missed a neighborhood meeting, but never said much either. The man had lawn gnomes older than my pickup truck. "I figured you'd need a backup," he said casually. "So I made copies. Just for fun." I blinked. "You made copies of our landmark application?" "Course I did," he said, handing me a USB stick. What kind of accountant doesn't keep records? Besides, I figured it was only a matter of time before that Karen woman started playing dirty. Emily came out just in time to hear him. "Mr. Reynolds, you just saved us." He winked. "Well, I've always hated that woman." And just like that, the past wasn't the only thing worth preserving. The present, this weird little alliance of stubborn farmers, sharp historians, nosy accountants, and flaming mad goats, was just as strong. They tried to burn us down. But all they did was light a fire. The first time I saw the official letter with a state seal stamped across the top, I didn't cry, but only because I'd run out of tears 2 weeks earlier during our 6th failed attempt to locate a Civil War troop manifest in the county archives. That letter, though? It was the moment we knew we had momentum. Walker Farm had officially made it onto the state register of historic places. It wasn't the final boss victory we needed, but it was a hell of a sword in the middle of this HOA war. And for the first time, the battlefield shifted in our favor. The listing came with preliminary protections, no forced demolitions, no unauthorized alterations, and most importantly, immunity from local zoning bodies. Translation? Karen's HOA might as well have been sending their angry letters to Santa Claus. But it got better. So much better. A few days later, I was walking the fence line with Emily and Ben, our lawyer, double-checking boundaries and surveying the property for next steps. That's when Ben froze mid-stride, pulled out his phone, and asked me a question that would change everything. "Jack, you ever looked into how your land interacts with public access laws?" I raised an eyebrow. "I mean, it's a farm. People usually stay off it unless they want to get chased by buckshot." "No," he said, pointing with his pen. "That road." I looked. The only paved road into the neighborhood, a tidy little stretch of suburban asphalt, cut right through the southern edge of Walker Farm. I'd driven over my whole life and never thought twice.
Ben grinned.
"Technically, now that your land is registered as historic and pending federal designation, you have legal grounds to restrict or revoke public access. That road runs across protected land." I blinked. "You're telling me I can close the only road in and out of the entire HOA neighborhood?" "Legally?" Ben said.
"Yes."
"Logistically? You'll be the most hated man in town for about 2 weeks." I didn't even hesitate. We filed the petition the next morning. It was like pulling a plug out of a beehive. The HOA's pristine little neighborhood exploded with fury. Carpool moms couldn't get to their Pilates classes. Retirees had to add 15 minutes to their golf commute. God forbid someone had to take a detour. You'd have thought I'd personally declared war on cul-de-sacs and lawn ornaments. Karen, naturally, lost what was left of her mind. She called an emergency town hall meeting at the community center, a building her HOA dues had paid for and probably wallpapered in taupe. Her goal? Bury me in public outrage. Paint me as the selfish redneck who'd turned history into a weapon just to spite his neighbors. I showed up, of course, because nothing screams victory like watching your enemy walk into their own ambush. Karen took the podium like she was announcing a national tragedy. "Jack Walker has endangered our entire community," she began, eyes scanning the crowd like a dictator mustering troops. He is abusing the historic registry process to isolate us and block emergency access. This is about safety, not history. I didn't even have to speak, because right then, a voice called out from the back of the room. Is that before or after you fine me $200 for having wind chimes? The crowd turned. It was Mrs. Blevins, a sweet older woman who once got HOA cited for having lavender instead of approved rosemary in her garden. Another voice followed. She fined me for putting up a birdhouse, and me for having a red mailbox. Suddenly, the room was alive, not with anger at me, but at her. Years of pent-up HOA frustration came flooding out like someone kicked over a hornet's nest, but this time the stingers were aimed squarely at Karen. I just stood in the back, arms crossed, watching her face turn redder than a HOA-violating rose bush. Her plan had backfired in spectacular fashion. She tried to expose me as the villain, but all she did was remind everyone who the real tyrant was. And as I walked out of that meeting, I knew the gate wasn't the only thing that had closed. So had the door on Karen's reign. They say desperate people do desperate things. And nobody does desperate quite like Karen with her back against the beige stucco wall. After the community meeting disaster, the road closure, and the humiliating chorus of neighbors airing their grievances like a 4th of July fireworks show of HOA injustice, she finally did what every entitled tyrant does when she's losing. She filed a lawsuit. Jack Walker is maliciously and intentionally sabotaging our community, the opening line read, as if I'd personally launched an artillery strike on her begonias. She accused me of exploiting historic protection laws to inflict harm on the neighborhood, block emergency access, and erode communal trust. Somewhere in the footnotes, I think she even blamed me for a drop in local bird populations. I wanted to laugh, but Ben, my lawyer, beat me to it. This is the legal equivalent of a toddler throwing a sippy cup, he said, tossing the lawsuit on my kitchen table like it was a coupon flyer. But we're still going to go in, guns blazing. And that we did. The courtroom was packed. Residents, reporters, a few nosy history buffs, and even Buckshot the goat made an appearance on a protester's sign out front. Let the goat be. Karen strutted into the courtroom in a power suit that looked like it had been starched with vengeance. She perched next to her high-priced attorney like she still believed this was a chess game and not, in fact, the beginning of the end. The trial opened with her team arguing that I had manipulated historic law to shut down public infrastructure and weaponize patriotism. I nearly choked on my water when they used that phrase. Then Ben stood up.
Cool. Calm.
Cowboy boots tapping gently as he paced. And then he dropped the hammer. He walked the court through the timeline, Emily's research, the Civil War depot records, the signed documents from the Department of the Interior, the state's official landmark designation. He even pulled out a copy of the historic registration plaque and placed it gently on the bench like a mic about to be dropped. This isn't a loophole, Your Honor. It's a legacy. This land isn't just protected, it's preserved. It predates the HOA by a century and serves as a standing testament to American history. The HOA, on the other hand, has no jurisdiction, no authority, and no business trespassing, threatening, or harassing my client. That, he said, is what this case is really about. The judge looked about one gavel bang away from laughing. Case dismissed. With prejudice. And just like that, the court ruled in my favor. Karen didn't just lose. She lost loudly. Reporters waiting outside caught every second of her storming down the courthouse steps, red-faced and ranting about setting a dangerous precedent. The clip made the local news that night under the headline, HOA versus history, Karen loses to Civil War goat farmer. But the best was still to come. While all this was unfolding, Mr. Reynolds, our local retired accountant and neighborhood Sherlock Holmes, had taken it upon himself to poke around in the HOA's finances. Just for peace of mind, he said. What he found wasn't just shady bookkeeping, it was a smoking crater of corruption. Over $100,000 in community maintenance funds had quietly disappeared over the last few years. Funds that were supposed to go to streetlights, landscaping, and sidewalk repairs. No records.
No invoices.
Just poof.
Gone.
And the only signature on those withdrawals?
Karen's.
The neighborhood lost what was left of its collective patience. Reynolds turned the documents over to the authorities. The IRS showed up 3 days later with suits, badges, and enough legal firepower to make a mob boss sweat. Karen tried to play it cool, claimed it was a clerical error, blamed a former treasurer, and insisted everything could be sorted out. But nobody was buying it anymore. The last time I saw her, she was shoving suitcases into the back of her car at 6 a.m., pale-faced and muttering into her Bluetooth headset. 2 federal agents stood across the street with folded arms and clipboards. By sunset, the house was empty. Karen was gone. And the HOA? It crumbled like a stale cracker in a rainstorm. 3 board members resigned within a week. A petition to dissolve the entire association passed by a landslide. The fines stopped. The threats vanished. And Walker Farm stood tall, untouched, unbothered, and finally free. Funny thing is, I didn't need to destroy the HOA. They did it themselves. I just made sure the world was watching. The fall of the HOA didn't just signal the end of an era. It ignited a full-blown revolution. The moment the paperwork was signed and the association officially dissolved, it was like someone had cut the leash on a town full of leashed-up golden retrievers. A collective breath was released across the neighborhood, followed immediately by the sound of hammers, laughter, and the glorious crinkle of inflatable lawn decorations being unboxed. The very next morning, the neighborhood began to transform before my eyes. First came Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old widow with the innocent face of a church pianist and the rebellious spirit of a punk rocker. She'd spent the last decade tiptoeing around HOA violations for planting non-compliant daisies and refusing to remove her wind chimes.
But now?
Oh, she snapped. I stepped outside with my coffee to find her front lawn covered in 100 bright pink plastic flamingos, arranged in tidy rows like an army of squawking rebels. At the front of the flock stood a homemade sign, scrawled in looping cursive. "This is for you, Karen." The Flamingo Rebellion had officially begun. By sunset, the rest of the neighborhood caught the fever. The Jeffersons down the street painted their house electric purple, added solar-powered string lights, and stuck a giant mural of a sunflower across their garage door. The retired vet on the corner turned his entire backyard into a mini golf course, complete with a pirate ship hole and a waterfall made from reclaimed bird baths. One guy even inflated a 20-foot T-Rex, mounted a Santa hat on it, and left it up year-round. "Seasonal depression doesn't stand a chance," he told me with a grin. And not a single soul complained. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, people finally remembered what it felt like to take joy in their homes. Kids rode their bikes, without fear of noise complaints. Porch swings creaked again. Barbecue grills smoked proudly. The neighborhood wasn't just surviving, it was alive for the first time in years. As for me, I wasn't just sitting back and admiring the chaos. I had a legacy to share. With Walker Farm officially protected and the HOA out of the picture, I decided it was time to open the doors to history. I transformed the old Civil War-era barn, the same one Karen tried to demolish, into a mini-museum. Emily helped me set up exhibits, wartime supply ledgers, preserved tools, uniforms, even a half-rusted saber we'd unearthed under the floorboards. We hung a banner above the entrance. Walker Farm, then and now, a living landmark. Kids came by on school field trips, wide-eyed and whispering about ghosts and cannonballs. Tourists started showing up, snapping selfies in front of the barn and asking if Buckshot the goat still lived on site. He did, and he loved the attention. Local bakeries donated snacks. Veterans stopped in to share stories and shake my hand. It felt right. Like this place had finally found its voice again. One afternoon, as I stood outside the barn watching a group of third graders marvel at a dusty old canteen, I heard music echoing from down the street. Someone had hooked up speakers and was blasting Born to Be Wild while stringing rainbow lights across their roof. A little girl ran past me, clutching a plastic flamingo like it was a trophy. This, I thought, is what freedom looks like. It wasn't just about pink birds and inflatable dinosaurs. It was about reclaiming something deeper: joy, individuality, community. The HOA had spent years crushing all that beneath the weight of fines and formality.
But now?
Now we had flamingos. And we weren't going back. We called it the HOA Free Festival, and let me tell you, it was glorious. It wasn't just a block party. It was a liberation parade with barbecue sauce, a victory lap with beer kegs, a middle finger made of fireworks aimed squarely at the ghost of HOA tyranny. Word spread fast, and by the time the day arrived, half the town had shown up. Kids, old-timers, tourists. Even Buckshot the goat had his own VIP area. He earned it. The centerpiece, of course, was the dunk tank. Sitting proudly at the center of the lawn was a life-size mannequin dressed in khakis, a pastel blouse, and a blonde bob wig. Clutched in her plastic hand was a clipboard labeled violation notices. Across her chest, a name tak, im Karen. $4-5 a throw. Anyone could dunk Karen into the tank. And boy, did they line up. First was a teenager who once got fined for parking his skateboard outside. Then the couple who got written up for planting lavender instead of HOA-approved marigolds. Even Mr. Reynolds stepped up, grumbling, "This one's for the missing streetlight fund," before nailing the target on his first try. There was live music, lawn games, enough smoked brisket to feed a small army, and a collective energy like we were all coming out of a long, gray winter into the brightest damn spring anyone had ever seen. People weren't just celebrating my win, they were celebrating their own freedom. No more fines. No more arbitrary rules. No more power trips disguised as neighborhood policy. Emily stood beside me, laughing as a group of kids tried to ride Buckshot like a rodeo goat. She nudged my arm and said, "You realize you started a cultural revolution with goats, flamingos, and a barn, right?" I grinned. "I'll put that on my tombstone." But not all visitors came for barbecue and goat selfies. Midway through the festival, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the front gate. Out stepped a man in a tailored suit and sunglasses slick enough to reflect your net worth. He introduced himself as Lucas Pryor, a representative from a development firm with a name that sounded like it belonged on Wall Street or the Death Star. "I've heard your story," he said smoothly. "Very inspiring. The whole stick-it-to-the-HOA angle is marketable. We'd like to make you an offer to purchase the land. Full buyout. 8 figures. You walk away rich." I didn't hesitate. "Not for sale," I said, leaning against the gate. He raised an eyebrow. "You could be set for life." I looked out over the festival, at the kids laughing, the music playing, the mural-covered houses, the neighbors free to be themselves without a single ounce of fear or formality. And I smiled. I already am. He didn't get it, but that's okay. He got back in his SUV and disappeared down the detour road, the same one that now wrapped around the neighborhood because my land, our land, was no longer a shortcut. It was sacred. The sun dipped low that evening as the festival wound down. I walked to the front of the property, just past the gate that had once stood as a line between war and peace, HOA and heritage. And there, freshly placed into the ground, stood the stone monument I'd commissioned, carved in clean, proud letters. "Welcome to Walker Farm, National Historic Landmark. HOA free since 2025. In loving memory of the HOA, may it never return." I ran my hand across the cool granite, feeling the weight of what we'd built. This wasn't just about a barn or a fence line. It was about taking back control, about protecting what mattered, and about reminding people that community isn't about sameness. It's about freedom. As the last of the partygoers drifted home, I stood at the edge of my land, the farmhouse glowing behind me, the barn-turn museum lit gently by string lights. The air was quiet. The land was mine. And for the first time in a long, long time, I smiled, knowing this fight was over. And we had won. Forever.